Well, I think we are going to start. So, welcome everybody to Manchester Museum. We are proud part of the University of Manchester. Yes, I am Diana Arzusa. I am the curator of the entomology collection at Manchester Museum. We are going to start with some housekeeping. We are not expecting any fire alarms. If an alarm goes off, please follow one of the members of the team. We can lead you the way outside. The toilets are just outside to the left. There is a sign posted for the toilets as well. So today, this afternoon, it's a pleasure to have all of you and our guest speaker, Derek Gow, in these first Wild Talks. These talks are connected to the Wild exhibition, that is our temporary exhibition. If you haven't seen it, please go down. It's in our new exhibition hall. Wild challenges the idea of wild, and also is about how people are creating, rebuilding, and also repairing connections with nature, especially when we are facing this biodiversity crisis, climate, and environmental changes. One of our study cases, we talk about rewilding, and that's Eric's expertise as well here today. So I am very pleased to welcome Derek Gow in his first talk. Derek is a conservationist, but he's also a farmer, and he's a pioneer in the reintroductions of beavers in the UK, water voles, white stork, and more recently, glowworms, in which our vivarium team is also working in this project. Today, we will start with the lecture with Derek Gow, following a Q&A session, and we will continue our conversation over a refreshment outside this room, and an invitation to go and see our wild exhibition. So, one enigmatic animal we haven't managed to reintroduce is the wolf. Let me welcome Derek Gow and his first talk, Hunt for the Shadow Wolf. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak today about the hunt for the shadow wolf. I've been lucky enough to write two books previously to this, one on the story of bringing back the beaver, which had a lot to do with the ups and downs and the ridiculous things that happened with regard to that creature, and very little to do with the political background which held its restoration up for probably the best part of 20 years. The hunt for the shadow wolf came about because when I was a wee kid, I lived in the Scottish borders. I lived in a town called Biggar, and not very far away from where our house was, there was an old farm sign at a place called Wolf Clyde that denoted, supposedly, that the place where the last wolf in Scotland was killed. And I can remember quite clearly a day when my mother and my long-suffering grandmother, we were on an excursion to Dundee. It was in July. It was blisteringly hot, and I was fighting with my brother in the back of the car, as we always did. And just to distract us, because we were driving our parents mad, she told us a story of how the wolf had been killed by a woman that had attacked with two children who were crossing through the landscape, and she'd used a metal Scots pancake griddle to smack it between the ears and finish it off. Now, for those of you who are not Scottish, there are two forms of pancake griddle. One is kind of like big and square, and it's got a fixed handle, and the other one's round and it's got a folding handle. So I'm not quite sure which one you would use to dent a wolf, but probably the first option would be the best. But when you start to look for a creature like this, it's complicated. You start off with great clarity, and you look at books and records, and they will tell you, well, they were definitely here, and these were the bounties, and these were the grants of land, and this is what happened. And probably at one point in time, you'd find that every single county, possibly every village, possibly every town, would have its own story about a last wolf. But what you realise when you begin to read and you start to go through the kind of dusty research papers in the bowels of places like the National Museum of Scotland is that the records are they're beginning to fall away. times past, and some of the early English writers that looked at the existence of this animal in Victorian times would tell you, even in their day, that you could see there had been more stories and more fragments of information, but they were simply no longer substantial enough to touch. And when you tried to examine them in any greater detail, age and a whole range of different social complications meant they fell away. But it's amazing, actually, how they still sometimes reappear. When you write a book, you get very involved in the research behind it, and then when you finish, you're still a wee bit obsessed. And sure as fate, as soon as you finish the thing and it's gone off to the publishers, somebody will turn around and present you with new information that you never had. So this is a gentleman who was cleaning lichen off an old church near Cirencester. And on one side of the old church, in the sandstone, there are engravings of fishes, and there's a fair bit of human graffiti. On the other side of the church, there's nothing other than this. So when you clean it away, what you can clearly see is a wolf of sorts. And it may very well, why would anybody carve it? Well, it may very well have been that again, somebody had been to a pulpit and damnation service in the church, and when they came out, the wolf was used as an allegory of destruction, that they sat there in the sun and they carved their wolf. The other explanation, which is less prosaic, is that this animal was considered, and we'll come back to this, to be something that was virtually demonic. So when you caught them in the big traps that were laid right the way through the landscape for them, commonly big pits lined by dry stain, then you would go in there, because if you knew anything of them, you'd know they weren't dangerous. You'd pin their heads to the ground with a forked stick, you'd bind their limbs together, and you'd reach into your pocket to bring out a roll of wax tailor's cord, and you'd sew their mouths up. And then you'd take them to the church, and then you'd torture them to death. So whatever impression prompted the maker of this to leave an effigy, they had options. We didn't always hate them here. Older cultures and different languages talk about wolves in a very relaxed fashion. There's an ancient Gaelic lay, translated into English, which says, "I see the ridge of Hines, the steep of the sloping glen, the wood of cuckoos at its foot, the blue height of 1,000 pounds of wolves and roes and elks." And they're describing a landscape that we can barely recognise as being British now. If you're going to see a landscape like this anymore, you're going to see it in North America or Canada. But there are over 236 different place names in the British Isles which are associated with the wolf. The ones in English are obvious: Wolf Clyde, Wolf Hope Lee, Wolf Hills, Wolf Castle, and so on. But as soon as you start to look, what you find is that in the older languages, which the English commonly didn't bother to translate, there are very many more. So in Gaelic, they're called Maddy or Lub. In Welsh, they're called Blythe. In Cornish, they're called Blade. And in Irish, Mactir or Breach, a variety of other names. And when you start to look for those names, there are even more. But then when you revert back to Old Norse or Saxon or any of the other languages which came with the different people who came to find their fortunes on this island, there are more still. It is the most remarked upon of our once native creatures. No other native species that existed before or since has been remarked upon in this way. We knew a lot about them once. We knew a lot about them because when we become interested in them, we become interested in them approximately 1,000 years ago when the Normans invade Britain and massacre the English on the battlefield of Hastings. And for those of you who are not English, you'll know perfectly well that that's still a public holiday held in Scotland in their honour. That basically this animal begins to feature as a creature we know at all. And it features as a creature because the huntsmen like them. They're very powerful. They're good foes. They can run for a very long time. They can put up a fight if they want to at the end with the dogs. So at the end of it all, wolf hunting is something that really starts with the Normans. And the wolf is quite clearly described as one of the great beasts of the chase, and therefore it's to be protected in the same way that deer and wild boar and the other beasts of the chase are protected. we start to see that attitude changing, perhaps around the same time, maybe just before the time of the Normans, because in 985, the English king Edgar poses a tax on the Welsh kings that his uncle Athelstan has defeated at the Battle of Brunanburg, and that tax is of 300 wolfskins a year. Now, for those of you who are interested in history, you'll know perfectly well that history, even in Britain, really recorded history, doesn't begin until monks and church people start to write things down approximately in the 12th century. There would have been scrolls and instructions before, but those instructions don't really begin until the 1200s. So it's not clear whether this actually happened, but when you look at the number and the clarity of the writers, even if it wasn't 300, if it was 297 or 156, it would seem to be the case that this bounty was imposed. But nobody knows what happened to them. I mean, wolf skins were valuable things. The teeth were valuable as amulets. It was believed they warded off toothache and drove away night devils and children. But what became of the bounty? And we don't know. We simply don't know. But on at least one occasion it's recorded that what they did with the fetid, stinking carcasses that the Welsh delivered to them was they put them in carts, they took them to Wolfpit in Suffolk, and they burnt them all. And that kind of burning, the analogy for destruction, well, it really starts to kick in as soon as you have the first monasteries and high church societies forming in Britain. And they form in and around the middle of the 1100s. You have orders like the Cistercians, the white monks, who walk from the borders of Lorraine in France to the wilderness that is in Wales to set up their land of order and to erect giant cathedrals to the glory of God. And with them come a whole variety of different abilities. They bring the ability to grow figs on the south-facing slopes. They bring modern agriculture so that in the middle of this wilderness, when you travel through to find the centres of cultural excellence, and you're going through forests and wastes and heathlands along roads that barely exist with potholes that are so big that you could easily drown in, and then when you cross the last ridge, you see the world of God, the Lord, then it was a truly impressive ability to tame land and install order. But one of the most valuable products they had were sheep, because the sheep produced wool, and the monks were great sorters of wool. So what that meant was that when you clipped your sheep once a year, the waste was taken out of the sheep, was taken out of the wool, the shit was discarded, any matted wool was thrown away. So by the time you finish, when you buy from the monasteries, you have a very high quality product. And that means that at a time when wool was the main source of apparel, that the British wool, even though it wasn't the finest wool in the world that was produced, was nevertheless extremely valuable. And that wool was bought by merchants, very commonly exported in huge quantities to the cloth manufacturers of in the Low Countries of Europe. So the sheep was something that was sanctified. Jesus was the good shepherd, and he gathered the sheep and took care of the sheep. And lambs were things that were tiny and valuable, and you had to be very careful that they survived. And the idea or the knowledge that out there in the lands beyond the lands of culture that the church had established, that there were creatures that were going to come out of a forest and destroy the sheep, to that culture was just abhorrent. So what you could do, of course, was you could pay to employ shepherds who were professional people who were the sheep during the day. You could employ night watchmen at night to oversee the sheep. You could pay to keep kennels of the large fighting dogs that you could use to attack and kill wolves, but they were dangerous, unpleasant creatures. And of course, it all meant that you had to spend money. So the church, as one of the major PLCs of its day, did what all PLCs do. They look at it and think, how can we save our cash? So what you do is you go into the pulpit and you tell everybody that this animal's from Satan and it's a very evil creature, and that what they must do in their lives if they want to go to heaven is they've got to go out into the forest and they've got to bring back their scalps and their tongues, and if they're minor criminals, then you can have your sentences remitted on the basis that you kill wolves. And what that does is it sets up this culture of hate and misunderstanding that is so deep. It's the beginning, it's the roots going down, that even to this day you can still see vestigial aspects of its cancer working. This is a site in Scotland, in Abernethy Forest, where you have this dry stone enclosure. You can see that the enclosure is on a hillock, on a hump, which means that anything running up to the walls to get in beside the sheep has to come up to get there. The wall would probably initially have been, almost 2 metres high. Along the top there would have been great flagstones, which have, of course, over time been pillaged for other reasons. And perhaps on top of the flagstones you would have had a turf embankment into which was set sharpened stakes that had one exit and one entrance, because at the end of it all, that's where the person who guarded the sheep through the night would be sitting with his dogs and his spear and his bow. And these structures, even though they're recorded on no modern map, if you go and ask the farmers that farm alongside them to this day, they will tell you they're the wolf cots. This is a wolf trap. There were very many wolf traps created right the way through the British landscape. They're commonly large conical mounds in some areas where you can dig down into the ground, and I'll show you one later. It was simply something like a gigantic well. But if you couldn't dig down because the ground was too wet or too stony, you built them up. So you maybe built something that would have the same radius as this room. It would be a mound of soil or a mound of stone. In the middle, there would be a cone going down into a pit in the earth. And what you'd do is you'd either bait that directly with dead sheep or carrion, or you'd build a structure, like a kind of little bit of a wigwam that went over the top, and onto that you cover it with ferns or heather or bracken, and you just throw the entrails of animals onto there. So the wolves came to explore it and fell down into the earth. And then when they fell down into the earth, people would do just exactly what I've just told you. They'd go down, they'd retrieve them, and they'd either take them away to kill them or use them for a variety of other purposes. There was always something you could do with a wolf. We poisoned them. This plant is a plant called aconitum, or monkshood. In part, it's suggested that its name comes from the fact that it has a cowl over its central section, but it's also possibly the case that this too could have been connected with a wolf, because at the end of the day, the monks were one of the greatest persecutors of this species that there were. In Welsh, in Old Welsh, it's called wolf choke, and Gaelic, it's called wolf aversion. And what happened with this plant was you would take the roots of the aconite, you'd chop them up, you'd make them into a brew, and then you'd add the nuts of the strychnine tree, which comes from Asia and is called nux vomica, to make a toxic solution. You would then go into a village and you'd find either a dead or a dying dog, and you'd stab it to death, and you'd take it and put it in a compost mound outside, a dung heap outside a house, so that it could rot down properly. And then when it was blue, you'd pull it out, put more holes in it, and you put your solution into the holes. And then you take this fetid carcass to the edge of a forest where wolves might be, and you'd lay it out as bait. Now, if you had a use for the wolf skins, you made sure that you added very much more nux vomica, because that would finish them quickly where they fed, whereas if you just wanted them dead, you didn't bother so much. But if you wanted them to have the skins or have other parts of their bodies, you wanted them right the way around the place where they'd been feeding. And as time goes on, we begin to add to the hatred. So it starts with the sheep, okay? The sheep are the problem. And then we start to look at the other things that wolves do. And of course, they're carrion eaters. And there's an ancient Gaelic poem. I won't read all of this now, we don't have time. But I mean, it gives you some idea of how they feel about this animal. And it says that this is talking about a place called Ederackle Shore. Ederackles is in the Atlantic coast of far north Scotland. And it says the lean and hungry wolf with his fangs so sharp and white, his starveling body pinched by the frost of a northern night, and his pitiless eyes that scare the dark with a green and threatening light. It's giving you a pretty good vision of the horror that was associated with them. So you look at their ability to disinter grave pits, and that makes them more demonic still. And what it means literally is that in places like Ederackles, that people have to row the body of the deceased off to the Isle of Handa and bury them in Handa if they don't want to find them disinterred in the morning. In Lochon or Gael and Schmarie in Yorkshire, same sort of thing applies. And in Athol in Scotland, it was formerly accustomed to surround the body of the deceased with flagstones. In England in the 12th century, more simpler still, there would be feues given to foresters or landowners to provide branches so that when you dug a grave and you put the person down in the grave and you filled the first part in with soil, halfway up the grave you then covered the first layer of soil with branches and then filled the last of it in so that anything digging down encountered this confusing tangle and hopefully gave up before it got down to the carcass beneath it. And then they cleared up graveyards or battlefields. There are plenty of records of wolves clearing battlefields in Britain from the time of the Orkney-Inga saga and the Battle of Waterfirth to the English in 1066. And in 1069, it was the Danish who were singing of how the Norman dead were left as a choice banquets for the wolves of Northumberland. And it was all hideously cruel. When people talk about some animals, I've been to things in the past where people have said, well, they passed away. None of these creatures passed away. We dealt out with every form of malevolence there was, a death that would be worse than hell. We poisoned them, we burnt them, we caught them in traps and where they severed their shattered limbs in attempts to try and get out. We know all this to be true. There was no worse fate. We hung them because they were criminals. And there was no worse fate for other common criminals for whom the judiciary made no distinction than to die a death and be hung on the tree where the wolves were. In the 9th century, it's recorded that one particular individual was given the sentence of having to wear a wooden wolf mask before they hung him. So by the time you get to that stage in life and society, you can get no lower. We don't know. There were definitely, again, in Saxon times, there were specific trees where the wolves were hung. We don't know if any of those still survive in our forests. We do know that there are dole trees still in the grounds of some of the big castles in the north. And the dole trees comes from the word douleur French, douleur in French, which means sorrow or mental anguish. And that's where people were hung well into relatively recent times. But for wolves, as I say, it's not clear whether any of these trees were involved their destruction as well. But what we do know is that until about 1929, when the Forestry Commission cut it down, that in South Wales, not very far from Abergavenny, that there was one large wolf paw nailed to an ancient oak, again until fairly recently. There are places where the wolf hunters live. So in Mansfield Woodhouse, one Walter the wolf hunt, who died in 1339, was employed by the county of Nottingham by the king for the service of chasing wolves outside the king's forests of Sherwood, if any could be found. So the bottom part of the building where Walter lived, you can ignore the brick, is still in place today. Entertainingly, the house still maintains a connection with wolves. It's now a nail bar. And when I went in to speak to the very pleasant little lady from Thailand who ran the business inside and asked her if she still had any connection with wolves, then she showed me quite clearly that if I stayed there long enough, she would easily be able to deal with my nails and provide me with a physical example that the connection was so. In the time of Edward III, you people are now starting to grant lands to other nobles to basically incentivise the destruction of wolves. And to do this, the nobles must keep the wolf dogs, which are these huge, fierce, mastiff-type creatures, nothing like an Irish wolfhound of modern times, which is a relatively recent cross between a Great Dane and a deerhound. And these were kept at their own cost. They were expensive to keep to destroy wolves and foxes. And indeed, the winding of the horn and chasing of the wolves would quite commonly be a contractual obligation on those landowners to ensure they were destroyed. The wolf dogs were still so valuable as late as the 1650s that Cromwell issued an order when in the time when he was attempting to subjugate Ireland to ensure that they could not be exported. So if any of them turned up in the docks at Liverpool, they were to be confiscated by the state and sent back to Ireland because they were still needed in those late years for the better destroying of wolves. in 1577. There's a Scottish Act of Parliament now brought into place. So the state is beginning to make a significant effort to ensure that the hunting times for the wolf are prescribed, and that if you encounter one in your community or in a forest near you, that you must report it. If you don't report it, then you will be fined. If you do report it, you will be rewarded. And if you kill a wolf, you'll get 6 shillings and 6 pence, and the other people in your community will be rewarded as well. So we've now reached a time when the state is going all out pretty much to exterminate these creatures. The term a hue and cry comes from the idea that when a wolf is observed in the vicinity of a village or a forest, that anybody who observes it has to go and notify the sheriffs, and that the sheriffs will then raise this hue and cry to create a thing called the posse comitatus. And the posse comitatus, which literally translates from Latin as the power of the people, is every male aged between 15 and 40 who's called out to destroy the creature. As late as 1691, in Warwickshire, there are still occasions when the posse comitatus is called out to destroy wolves, but by then they're almost certainly fading fast. And there are bounties. In Scotland in 1621, in Sutherland, the extraordinary price of £6, 13 shillings and 4 pence is paid for the killing of one wolf. And as late as, again, the early 1600s, you have the tenants of the Breadalbane lords in Argyllshire being obliged for the use of their land to produce 4 spears a year, sharpened and ready for hunting of the wolf. As late as 1652 in Kilkenny in Ireland, there are posters which are printed and proclamations read, which tell common people that it's £5 for a male, respectively for a female and a male wolf, £2 for a hunting cub, and 10 shillings for a suckling cub. And if you bring their carcasses or their skins in, then this is what you will receive from the Exchequer. But the scary thing about this, when you look at your initial hatred and your initial lies, and then the other lies and stories you make up, is where it ends, okay? Because it starts very much with wolves in Western Europe as an element, or the persecution starts as an element of organised religion. And when these settlers that then expand from our nations in the 1600s go to places like the Falkland Islands or Tasmania or the Americas or the Australias, then they start to behave in a way which is genocidal. You begin with the wolf and the bounties on the wolf, and then you apply that bounty, as we shall see, to a number of other predators which have nothing to do with a wolf. But in no time at all, as soon as you encounter peoples who live there, who oppose the idea that you are going to take their lands and smash their cultures, then you're printing posters that are nearly exactly the same as those that Cromwell created, offering £50 for the head of the scalp of a male, £30 for the scalp of a female, a few shillings for the scalp of a baby, and maybe a pound or less for the scalp of a child. There's no distinction between the savage human wolves and the other creatures that we exterminated in the past, because exterminate them we did. I don't know if you've got a thylacine in your collection in Manchester Museum. Well, there you go, you have. Because this animal was a giant, it was a large carnivorous opossum. It was called the Tasmanian wolf or the Tasmanian hyena by the stockmen who went or were sent from London to ensure that the sheep flocks they were building up in these new worlds were profitable. And when the sheep failed because of fire or because the grasses were too acrid for them or because of disease or for whatever other reason, what you could not do is that farm manager in place was trying to explain to those shareholders in London that you'd screwed up. That was utterly unacceptable. What you had to do was find something to blame it on. So of course you blamed it on the thylacines, or you blamed it on the Tasmanian Aboriginals, and what you completely ignored was the fact that, see all those feral dogs that you brought there with you and allowed them to run free? They were the biggest killer of sheep there was. So we applied it to the thylacine. In Japan, it was applied to the Honshu and the Azo wolf. So as soon as Japan decides to industrialize its farming operations, it employs American ranchers. And these creatures that they were forest gods. There are still shrines to them on the island there that protected your fields from the monkeys and the boar and the deer. They're exterminated with the poison and everything else within less of a generation. The same holds true for the brick red water of the Falkland Islands, for the very many different forms or subspecific forms of the North American wolves that the settlers encountered. And then that last wee picture off to one side, it's all kind of blurred. That's one of the last of the Sicilian wolves. They survived everything, including the Romans, but by the time the sheep farmers got there, they lasted until about 1930. But with the hunting of the wolf passing in time, the dogs that were used to hunt them also didn't last so very much longer. They're a dead and dying breed in Ireland, probably by the 1830s, because they're large, they're difficult, they're fierce, and you just don't need them anymore. So what's the point in making the effort? In Scotland, Hector Boas, writing in the 15th century, says that there's not even a lithograph or an illustration of what the Scottish wolf dogs looked like. They died out so long ago. But for a very short time at least, and for the most sinister of reasons, one or two people kept them. In the 1600s, you have a movement, a religious movement that develops in Scotland called the Covenanters. And this is basically a group of people who protest at the interference with the religious observance by the then king, the Stuart kings. And they refuse to attend the services that are prescribed by the crown. And therefore they're persecuted. And they're persecuted by one chap who's called Sir Robert Grierson of Lag, the Baronet of Lag in Dumfriesshire in southern Scotland. And when he died, it was said of him that he was so evil that Satan himself rose from the sea and rode his chariot of fire down the Solway to pick up his body so it could take him straight to hell, because he used his wolf dogs to hunt the people. And there is ample evidence that as the Americas opened up, these things were exported. They were exported to be kept in kennels, frothing and foaming at the mouth, so that when it suited you to do so, you could take them out to kill the indigenous people. They are no longer in existence, thank God. But as the wolf declines in Britain, and the bounties fade, and the records of their killings go, the traps become a problem, because time after time, Parliament makes it clear that if you use crossbow traps or you use the pits and anything happens to anybody else, so a child falls in, a cow falls in, somebody gets an arrow through their groin, then you are responsible and you have to pay. So what you see in southern Britain is there are places like at Swanmoat House in Hampshire, off in the corner of a park, there's a deciduous woodland. In that deciduous woodland, in the old order and survey maps that mark the spot, there is a wolf trap. But it's all flat, it's all filled in. So as soon as you didn't need them anymore, you filled them in. And perhaps only in the north of Scotland, in the valley of the Findhorn, just beneath Inverness, is the only place where you can still see the old stone traps in existence. And they're still in existence because they needed them until relatively recently. One of the greatest stories, and Scots are always good, hopefully, at telling stories, is of a hunt that was taken in the valley of the Findhorn at the request of the Laird of Macintosh in 1743, because once again a black wolf has attacked a woman with 2 children who are crossing the valley to try and get to Inverness. And the Laird is informed of this, and he orders his retainers and huntsmen to be present at the hunt the following morning to destroy the beast. And it's critical that a guy called McQueen is present, because he's the best stalker there is in the district. He has very fine hunting dogs, and they send word to him that he must attend, and McQueen sends word back that he will. The hunt gathers in the morning. It's a cold, frosty day. And when it gathers, it's still dark, and they wait there for McQueen to come with his dogs, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And halfway through the morning, just as the mist's rising, Towards them they can see this ghost-like figure with these wraith-like dogs walking down the valley towards them. And the laird rides out to meet him and he said, well, where have you been? We've lost the best part of a hunting morning. We're relying on you. And at that point, McQueen pulls back the plaid of his cloak and he takes out the head of the black wolf and he throws it at the feet of the laird. And he said, as I came down through the glen, I forgathered with the beast. The dogs turned him, I wrestled with him, and I stabbed him, and I cut off his head and brought away his countenance for fear that he might come alive again, because they're precarious creatures. We don't know whether that story is true or not, but like many of the old cultures, oral storytelling has a fairly firm foundation of it may not be exactly the way it happened, but there will be something in the story. And Roy Dennis, who's a friend of mine who's done a lot of work with birds of prey, was saying that one afternoon he was watching an Australian rugby international in his house up in Abernethy, and he said as he's sitting there watching it, this chap from the opposing team runs through the Australian runs through the opposing team, scores a try, and the announcers to who's by then very excited is shouting, "Well done, dog catcher." And his other commentator says, well, why did you call him dog catcher? And the guy says, well, because he's a McQueen, and his family killed the last wolf in Scotland. We don't really know when the last wolves died. What we do know is that the relics of them are very few. So this is one that was killed possibly in the late 1600s near Pitlochry by another chieftain there. And this thing turns up. So this turns up in a catalogue for the sale of a museum in London in the 1850s, and that's the illustration that's in a catalogue. And I mean, it's not a very exact illustration of a wolf, and there's a fair degree of artistic license there, but it might just be one. Wherever it is, it has now gone. And what you'll find, and I'm sure that is not the case with the Manchester Museum, is a lot of charlatans used to have a fair bit to do in the museum, and these people were liars and thieves. So, of course, what happens is that wolf is sold to another museum. That's what it looks like when it's sold to a museum. And a few years later, somebody else goes to the museum and they illustrate the wolf again. And you can quite clearly see that though the pose is kind of similar and the paw's turned in the right direction, that you're really looking at another animal altogether, aren't you? I mean, it just doesn't really look the same. And that's because that's a sheepdog that somebody strangled because the old wolf was looking a bit tatty and they didn't want to make any marks on it, so they've strangled it, and then they've cut it, taken its skin off and restuffed it just to ensure that when the people come to the museum that they're going to see a wolf that's really well put together. I know you wouldn't do anything like that nowadays. So when it comes to other remains of the wolf, they're few and far between. There are skulls from old caves right the way through Britain. There are skulls of the peat diggings. But here, this is the boathouse at Lochcarn in southwest Wales, which exists in the middle of what once would have been a huge marsh. And approximately the early 1800s, when the banqueting hall was being renovated, somebody looked up the chimney and they found 2 wild boar skulls, the skull of a couple of roe deer, and four skinned wolf paws. Now, we believe these are from a wolf. There has been a DNA assessment done, and there's also been a radiocarbon dating assessment done, and it suggests that these came from a wolf, and these are possibly anywhere between the late 1600s and the early 1800s. There's some more work being done to look at the DNA and the age of the wolf remains in Britain, and at this moment in time, so no doubt these will be dated again. But the long and short of it is that when we look at the extermination of the animal, we've actually got rid of everything. We've got rid of most of the bones, the skins, everything. So by the time you hate something, it's a victim, it's an enemy, it's a demon. You don't want to keep any of the bits of it. This is another kind of like enigmatic illustration from Northern Ireland, of a painting. This guy sitting there is a chap called William Watson. He ran a pack of Kerry foxhounds, and in 1760 it was recorded that his pack of Kerry foxhounds killed a wolf. So the dog sitting with its head on his hunting breeches is the dog that actually killed the wolf, and if you look kind of closely at his feet, there's the skin of the wolf on the floor. But the fact that these things don't survive is not really that surprising either. There's a colleague of mine in Germany who's the mayor of a place called Windsor, And he said that when he was young, his dad, who had killed a wolf somewhere, and he had this wolf skin on the floor, and he said the thing stank. The house was damp. You had an old stone floor, and he said, you come in there, and he said, for every day of his young life and well into his teens and beyond, you come at the smell of decaying wolf. And Dad used to love having it on the kitchen floor so all his mates could come in, and when people came to the house, he could tell his story of the bloody, boring wolf hunt once again. And he said, but his mother couldn't stand it. And when Dad died and we're sorting through his possessions, I picked this thing up off the floor. I look at my mum and say, what do you want me to do with it? And she said, take it out of the yard and burn it. So, these things don't survive as bits of animals for very good reasons, which are very human. As late as the 1800s, it's suggested that the bounties were still being paid for scalps in Flixton and Saxton in Yorkshire, but by then you're probably sort of like, once again, entering the realm of liars and cheats. So people were going out into the streets and of townships around them and finding a dog that's just about dark enough and just about the right size and whacking it over the head with a brick and scalping it and taking it in for the sum of 5 shillings. None of the bones that have turned up in recent years and some of the peat mosses in places like Caithness have turned out genetically to be anything other than dogs. But here's the dilemma. When you look at the 1,000+ artefacts that have been recently tested by a project in Oxford University, all of which have the most common dog DNA there is, then what were you actually looking at? What did it look like? This, in the top picture, is a wolf-dog hybrid from Italy. This is a not known animal from Japan, but photographed very recently on camera traps. So it's perfectly possible that if you're looking at the remains of these animals, that the bones tell you it was a dog, whereas the physical appearance for people who knew no better is that it's not a dog. It doesn't look like a dog, it looks like a wolf, and it kills sheep. So if it kills sheep, it's a wolf. So we keep on killing them. And when did they finally finish? Well, we don't really know. There are records of wolf hunts in Britain after the hunt on the Findhorn in 1743. There was another one killed at a place called Shenval in the Cairngorms National Park in 1780, and there may very well have been wolves killed in Ireland thereafter. But by the time you get to the late 1700s, society in Britain is changing very greatly. After, in 1745, 2 years after McQueen's hunt, you have the last of the Jacobite rebellions. And what happens after that is that with the defeat of the Stuart kings, is that the children of the Scottish nobility who are not executed are intermarried with the children of the English nobility on purpose, to ensure loyalty to the Hanoverian crown. And what that means in practice is that the people who have no money in the north but big areas of land, and the people in the south who have lots of money but no land, are then able to satisfy the urges for both of these commodities that they have. And one of the families who move up to Scotland into Caithness are the Sutherlands. So the Duke of Sutherland, who's of the Gower family, moves up to marry the spinster maid. And they're not really interested anymore. The system, the old clan system that kept the supporters of the Stuart kings going with its retainers and farmers and tacksmen and champions, that all falls away after the war and it's gone. And the only thing these people are interested in is money. And the first thing that comes north are the sheep. And the sheep are not there before. And with them come English shepherds or lowland border shepherds. And these people are Christians like you will not believe. It is very likely that in the closing years of the wolf's time in Britain, that in the valley and the vale of the River Neva in Sutherland that the last wolves were. There are plenty of records from the late 1600s from the hunting people that nowhere else in Scotland were they as abundant. And it is very likely that for as long as the hunting lords survived in direct parallel to William the Conqueror, they made an effort to ensure that, yes, of course they hunted wolves and they killed a few, but they didn't kill them all because all your pleasure's gone after that. And it's also very possible that not only did they attempt to do this, but at different times in different parts of Britain, and we don't know about Scotland, but certainly in England, that hunting aristocracy made an effort to get wolves from other parts of Europe and bring them here and let them go, so that they could again pursue their hunting enthusiasms. So when exactly a British animal finishes, and it's something else from somewhere else replaces it, we just don't know. But with the coming of the sheepmen, that was it. No tolerance for anything that looked at a sheep in any remotely funny way. They were all dead. Everything was dead. So, where are we now with wolves? Honestly, I'm so bad as an individual. I don't have my glasses on. I get my slides wrong. I thought that was an image of our last Secretary of State for Agriculture, but you can quite clearly see that it's not her, it's her father, okay? So, the interesting thing is that I don't suppose many of you have much to do with the farmers' unions here, but when you start to talk to these people, they'll tell you that nothing can be done, okay? Nothing at all. That they're not going to have a landscape out there where even a frog or an insect can survive. So when you start to talk to their unions about reintroducing things like lynx and wolves, they just tell you no. But the good thing is that you're now having some of their meetings in Oxford where the little tribal clans assemble every January. And the Secretary of State this year felt obliged to go in and say this. Never before has the Secretary of State in Britain ever said it's never been a thing that would ever have been remotely considered. So the nice thing is, at least they're beginning to know that the fans of hope are beginning to burn. Oh, another mistake. So, I'm not quite sure about this one. I wanted to show you a picture of the Secretary of State. That thing there, that's the Secretary of State. Okay, and you can see that it's been held by a pig. And that's another one of the litter standing right next to her. He's done so much damage to the economy of this island, it's beyond belief. You have to be very careful about this. So the sad thing is that just as, we sort of look at a time of hope, and we'll have a look at what hope looks like in a minute, there are still people right the way through the range of the wolf in the world who will treat them in this way. This is a political statement. This is the sort of thing that happens in countries like Spain where when the government decides that you're going to finish the old killing, and you stop it, and you forbid it, and you say you are not doing this anymore, is that this dark little band of people with the same bubbling, vile concoction of hate that's flowed from the early 1100s until now are still present. And that's what they think of when it comes to the protection of the wolf. But the protection of the wolf's a reality. And in country, after last weekend, we had the most marvellous gathering on the farm where people from all over the world spoke about this animal. And these are from the lowlands of Holland, from Belgium, from Germany, from countries where this creature was burnt out 170 years ago. And then in 1979, the European Parliament, under the terms of the Benn Convention, says, that's it, the wolves are protected. And slowly, without any reintroductions at all, these animals come back from the east. So when we look at the heads that are on the pavement outside the Spanish Parliament in Madrid, this is how the bulk of the Dutch population feel about the wolf. What they want to do with the wolf is get a selfie with it. The other day somebody sent me this lovely little piece of footage from YouTube of this guy cycling across the Veluwe, which is this big heathland that looks like the New Forest. And as he cycles past this wee sidetrack off into the heath, there's a jolly big wolf with its tail up and its paws forward getting ready to play with them. And the guy's got a kind of a helmet cam on as he's cycling, and you can see he's looking back and he's accelerating away as fast as he can possibly go. And the wolf eventually gives up chasing him because it's no fun and he's not going to catch that antelope. So we've entered a new time in the relationship. The badness, yep, it's still there, but it is no longer part of how wider society as a totalitarian whole feel about this creature. We've moved on, and okay, we're not medieval peasants, most of us don't keep sheep and chickens and live in a medieval hut in the dark, but we have the opportunity now to look at this in a different way. In Britain, unlike these other continental European countries, the wolf can never be a reality until one day we go get them from the Germans and put them in boxes and bring them back to this land. We absolutely know that from a biological point of view, there is no earthly reason why wolves couldn't live here. We have plenty of introduced deer. It's estimated that the national population number is about 1 million now, and that it's rising by 10% a year. You know, the old objections about we can't have them here because they'll kill our sheep. Well, every year domestic dogs kill 17,000 sheep. Every year the deer kill somewhere in the region of 40 of us in road traffic collisions. They present life-changing injuries for another 200, and there's 74,000 accidents. That this can't continue if we're going to grow forests for the future to cool this planet down. Then we can't grow forests where we have these things pruning them down to the earth. So the case for the reintroduction of the wolf is clear. We had a good conference last week, and in about a month's time, we're going to sit down with our continental colleagues, and though I'm sure it will be ignored, we will probably find the funding and the space and the time to do a wolf plan for Britain. And we'll have a look at this, and we'll have a look at what happens in Europe, what the problems are, because the problems aren't really sheep anymore. In situations like this, it's people feeding the damn wolf. And if you feed that wolf that's just curious about you to begin with, is a wolf that then looks at you and thinks, where's my dinner? And if your dinner's not appearing every time you do that, then you start to get wolves that you're going to have to kill because they become dangerous. But if we just basically treat them with the respect they deserve, then there is no earthly reason why one day, at some stage in the not too dim and distant future, we can't learn to live once again with the wolf. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Derek, for this fascinating journey through time. Has been really, really inspiring, the last part of your talk.
Thank you.
So now is this time for a Q&A session. Derek, do you mind sitting here with me?
Thank you.
Well, questions from the public?
Okay.
I'm just wondering, given that if we do introduce them to this country...
Just a second for the... Thank you.
Given that they, if it is introduced to this country, it will probably have to be enclosure. That's because all the others are being introduced that way. Is there anywhere in Britain that could happen?
There's a recent study done in Scotland which shows that it suggests that from an ecological point of view, you have enough woodland cover and enough prey to have between 50 and 100 packs running there. So, no, they wouldn't be in enclosures. The initial proposal for an enclosure came from an estate called Allerdale in Scotland, and the idea was that you put a fence around a mountain chain and put the wolves out into some vast area of land, and that you either fed them or they hunted the red deer within that area. In the end, you'd be feeding them, that's for sure. The deer wouldn't stand them for that long. But the long and short of it is that we live in an island now. There are 74 million of us, approximately. A small industry, a very small industry, keeping one woolly animal, perhaps 7,000 people, dictate to everybody else what's going to live in this land. That's the reality of it. The sheep that were worth a huge amount of money 1,000 years ago are now worth next to nothing. And if there isn't an export trade going for all these small lambs, and they're not subsidised, then they wouldn't be there at all. And what they do, we have 22 million that rise to 32 million, and what these things do is see these things called hills and mountains that are open, they strip all the vegetation from them. All those habitats should be woodland. The willow would come first, and then the alder, and then the oak, and then the other trees. And the sheep basically destroy everything. They play a huge part in the exacerbation of flooding. They play a huge part when it comes to the siltation of rivers, when they're brought down to the lowlands to fatten, and the soils that are all dislocated by the feet flow off into the river in the winter time. And what this means is you just have rivers now that are dead zones for all variety of different reasons, but one of them being this lost silt, which is of course in its own turn full of ivermectins and other chemical ills. So for as long as the sheep are here, there'll be a fight about it. And our sheep are not like continental European sheep breeds in that we've developed hill sheep which can live independently on their own. So they don't follow a bellwether and they won't easily come into corrals at night. But that's a cultural thing. You know, come the day we decide we don't need as many sheep, then this creature has no reason at all why it shouldn't be living free. It's not a particular danger for people, it's an issue for sheep.
Next question.
My question was going to be,
what are they going to do to sheep?
Mine was, yes, how the landscape would change essentially in response to a wolf introduction, but you've covered that quite well.
Yeah, and what it would also do is, I mean, one of the other speakers is a guy called Pedro Prata. He is from the Coa Valley in Portugal. It's a rewilding project. If any of you ever have an interest in going to Portugal, go there. It's beautiful. And they are directly passing cash back to little communities, little people who are trying to run artisan type food production and wine production in the region. And the wildlife's spectacular. They have a viewing pit cut in the top of rock of the valley where you can go sit in there. They pull camouflage nets over you, and 85 griffon vultures come down and feed right round you, which is just the most incredible experience. Anyway, you go to that valley, the wolf has come back, and it's all reforesting very rapidly because 180 years ago, for whatever economic reason, the sheep no longer became economically viable, and that was it. And they finished in no time at all. So when you walk through that valley, you can see the stone, you can see the dikes, you can see the stone handling yards, you can see the little houses, you can see the sheds, you can see all the infrastructure, but it's all covered by trees. And it's just a different time has come. Just to finish on that, we were talking about sheep. The other thing that is also an interesting observation from the Netherlands is, see all these dogs that are running up and down in forests off the lead? You cannot do that where there are wolves. Or you can do it once, and then you're going to have to go and get another dog. So the wolves are a tremendous balancer in all sorts of different ways. It wouldn't just be bringing a balance to the deer, it'd be balancing what we can do with our pets, and also balancing our attitude with regard to nature, because on this island, we live in a completely impoverished natural environment. We have soils where you can't even find the 24,000 bacteria that should be in there per square inch. You can find 5. We're really going to have to do something quite significant about this, and basically coming back to one of the most difficult creatures we had and saying, it's time to make peace, might be a fairly significant step.
Thank you. Another question here.
What do government bodies think of, this thought process, like Natural England and organisations like that? And when could we look to see a wolf plan for Britain?
Oh, we'll write one this year, next year. What do government bodies think about it? No. I mean, I've been involved with beavers. The white stork stuff wasn't quite as much of a battle as the beaver was, but I mean, we're still fighting about beavers, and we're fighting about beavers on a time where we know that everything there is falling off the edge of a cliff, be it, there was an article the other day which suggested over the last quarter century that 40 million songbirds have disappeared from the skies above us. This year it's predicted that we're going to have 40% less house martins and swallows. There's a colleague of mine who was working on ring ouzels and Dartmoor, and he wrote a lovely little article for The Guardian 2 years ago about the sound of extinction, which is total silence. And that was the last of its calling ring ouzel cocks gone. It's terrifying. And yet, the government, what will they got? Well, the statutory nature conservation organisations are very weak. Without being rude about it, many of the people, certainly in the middle, are commonly inept. So you have leaders who have a vision, you have foot soldiers who really want to change things, and you probably do have, that was maybe a wee bit harsh, you probably have some very decent individuals operating in a system that is just so bureaucratically idiotic that it's beyond description, and therefore they will do nothing about something like this until they're told to do something politically. And even when they're told to do something politically, they will foot drag like you will not believe. It will be a yes minister scenario where they're told to do it and they just keep kicking that ball in the long grass. None of this will come unless people become angry about it and start needling politicians. Because believe you me, organisations like the National Farmers Union are very quick to do that. They lobby like hell.
Wow. What do you think that will be the major challenge in here for the reintroduction of wolves in Britain?
It will simply, in the first instance, it will be inertia. And it will be, none of the big organisations will get involved with anything like this. In the end, if something starts to happen, they'll all say it was their idea, but they won't do anything. Nothing at all. So inertia, we can maybe do a little bit about inertia. We can start to make a fuss and start to talk about it and see whether that anything else comes from that. I mean, I worked with beavers for a quarter of a century, and I worked with them in a time where there wasn't a single Eurasian beaver in a zoo. And I brought the first animals back in from Poland, and then animals in from Norway, and then animals in from Bavaria. And it always, there were a few friends that helped, but it was a pretty lonely place to be when you were doing that of your own volition. But what you always found is that when you pursued one course of action and it was stopped, and you'd look at it and think, this is never going to be, that within no time at all, something else would happen. Somebody else would come along. Something would happen that you could not predict. And all of a sudden, it would be moving in a different direction. And I think that's what we have to do with the wolf, is you have to make a beginning, and you have to make a fuss, and you have to start making a case for it, and then you have to see what happens, because there's no other process that will run this forward. So that will be the first bit, is inertia, and then the next bit will be opposition. Farmers' unions will squeal like hell, and there'll be all sorts of stories about how the children can't keep the sheep and their tradition and the way of life and everything else. But, you know, I'm a farmer as well, and in all fairness, there has to be an awful lot of growing up done in that industry. I mean, does anybody here have an entitlement? Does anybody here just assume that when you're born and you fall out of your mother's womb, that you're going to get a thing called a single farm payment that's going to give you between 40 and 120,000 pounds of everybody else's money for the rest of your life? No, well, that's odd. I mean, I get that. Thank you very much. And what I normally do is spend it on the pub and beer on Saturday night when I feel like it, and maybe buy a new Land Rover once a year. You know, it's just crazy that one sector of society is subsidising another sector of society, and that when you actually look at the actuality of that, it's a sector of society that will tell you that you have to farm every single inch of Britain, which is 40 million acres, if we're all going to survive. But what it then doesn't tell you is that 85% of the calories you consume come from East Anglia, which prompts the question, what the hell is everybody else that's getting this money actually doing with it? And the answer is all sorts of bizarre things. So we need to look at how we overcome that. And then if you overcome that, then you have to look at, you know, persuading sufficient politicians that this should be done. And that's not an easy thing to do. So in answer, I don't think wolf reintroduction will be happening anytime soon. But I do think that we need to move desperately on with things like beaver, and they need to be everywhere. They need to be in urban Manchester, in the rivers, everywhere they can be, because this animal heals nature. It creates landscapes to which all life we know returns, the ducks, the fish, the amphibians, you name it, they return to beaver-generated landscapes. Shelduck fly in from the sea to nest in the burrows that they create in land. If we can't do that, and we really, really must, then we're in for a fairly bleak ride into the future.
I'm a person who stands up for badgers, and if there's any badgers left, and you did manage to reintroduce wolves, how would those two species get along?
Oh, they'll get along just fine, because wolves like to eat badgers very much. So see the life of Riley that your badgers have been having, whereby they live in big sets and they have half-open burrows and very big entrances, and they go out for little walks in the countryside in the evening, and they like to think they're a big predator now. They're not a big predator at all. They're small fry. As soon as the wolves come, they will figure out where the little trails are, they will dig them out their burrows, and they will crunch them up squealing. Badgers,
if there's any left by that point anyway.
Well, you know, when you look at what we are doing, the wolves won't do that. And what badgers would do is they would adapt their lifestyle, and they would adapt their presence to the presence of the predator, because all these creatures are inextricably interlinked. These environments that, you know, I mean, I'm sure some of you read George Monbiot's book Feral, but on Saturday, a lady called Dr. Danielle Shreve from Royal Holloway College spoke about the animals that were here between the ice. And every time the ice comes and goes, you have the same guild of creatures. You have elephants, rhinos, bison. Occasionally you might have muskox. Sometimes they weren't here. Barbary macaques, lions, leopards, and all the things we think of as being familiar in Britain. They all know each other. They've lived with each other. Beavers are 40 million years old, as an example. They've lived with wolves and big cats and everything else right the way through that time until the last 200, when we snuffed them out. None of these creatures have forgotten the old relationships they have, and the badgers would simply reform themselves. That's what would happen. But yes, they would consume badgers.
We have time for last questions. If we have one. Yeah? I have one.
Okay?
What was your motivation to become a conservationist in this sense? Because we know that you are a farmer, and how was the transition between being a farmer and now changing into a
Well, I'm
conservation?
not really a farmer anymore. The few animals I have are just their lawnmowers. We have the farm is split in two halves by a road, and in one half there is one wild boar, and in the other half there is an apprentice that will one day be a big wild boar, but at the moment it's small and stripy. They don't have to do anything than the work they're employed to do. And the work these creatures are now employed to do is to change the land. They're there to dig holes, distribute plant seeds, move tree seeds through the landscape, do what they can do to present living opportunities for other creatures. My interest, so I mean, yes, I worked in agriculture for 5 years when I left school. I'd always been terribly interested in nature conservation as well, which was a bit of a kind of schizophrenic type interest. And I read all Gerald Durrell's books when I was little, and you become inspired with this vision of saving all the little brown creatures. And then basically I never thought I would have much to do with zoos, but I worked with a lot of rare breeds of domestic livestock, and eventually I was asked if I would run one small crappy zoo in Scotland, and I said yes, and we had quite a bit of money to change it. Then I went to Jersey and I did the summer school there, and really my interest has come from there. And I mean, it's a short life. If you're going to do things in life, guys, you look at COVID and the way that made people think. Bloody do it, and do it bloody fast. If you've got a dream and you really, don't leave it as a dream. If you never try to realise your dream and you fail, then you don't want to be regretting it as your eyes are closing when that beep's running in hospital at the end of it all. Do it, and do it fast. So for me, I mean, I've now reached a stage in life where the only thing that matters is that you spend what time you can spend ensuring that poor little creatures, realistically, that have very little in the way of a voice speaking for them, we give them opportunities we can. And it's as simple as that. And I'm not interested in meetings, I'm not interested in fandangos. I don't want to make friends with most of the nature conservation people I kick about, because they're too damn boring and too damn inept. And as soon as you sort of get to the stage where you just start cutting your Christmas card lists down to what realistically matters, it's tremendously liberating, because you're here to do that job for as long as you can, and nothing else matters. If I fail, I fail. But at the end of the day, I will have tried. And I think that's, one of these things that all of us need to think about. Earlier in life, sooner is better rather than later. But if you've got a dream, live it.
On that note, it's been a real pleasure to have you and your inspiration to all of us. So many thanks, Derek, for your.
Thank you very much.